It's good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. We're ready to start. First of all, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Ingrid Justice. I'm the Director of Marketing at HighScope Educational Research Foundation. Today, HighScope is excited to support the NAEYC Virtual Institute with a featured session on the topic of family engagement with our Chief Research and Innovation Officer, Dr. Iheoma Iruka. Before I introduce Dr. Iruka, I would like to remind you that all participants are muted at this time. However, if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box. We will have time at the end of the presentation to answer questions. We'll leave 10 or 15 minutes to have a Q&A session. You will receive a certificate of attendance in your email 24 hours after this session. And we are recording this session, so afterwards you'll be able to watch it again or find it in the Virtual Institute library as part of the NAEYC Virtual Institute. With that, I would like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Iheoma Iruka.
Hello.
Hi, Iheoma. Dr. Iruka is the Chief Research Innovation Officer and Director of the Center for Early Education Research and Evaluation at HighScope. Iheoma is engaged in projects and initiatives focused on how evidence-informed policies and practices in early education can support the development and experiences of children from low-wealth households, ethnic minority children, especially Black children, through family engagement and support, quality rating and improvement systems, and early care and education systems and programs. Please welcome Dr. Iruka.
Thank you, Ingrid. Hello, everybody in Zoom land. I want to say hello again and to thank you for taking some time to be with me. I know I'm here on the East Coast, so I know it's lunchtime, so I know you're probably eating, some of us. And then some of us are probably just starting their day in the West Coast. So just thank you for being here. And I hope that this session or this virtual institute will be of great value to you personally, but also to those that you work for and on behalf of. So today, I'll talk about family engagement and support and us seeing it as an essential part of children's well-being and learning. And I use the word essential because that has been the word that we have used for childcare, right? That now we have recognized as essential for all aspects of our lives, right? We know there's all these op-eds that have been written talking about, you know, childcare is essential in order to restart the economy. So similarly, I think that we have to think about families being essential and critical for children's well-being, right? Just like all the discussions about racism and racial injustice, we can't just talk about it. We literally have to live it. And so I'm hoping that today we'll really begin to fully live what it means to really engage with and support our families. Making sure I can have control over it. So I first start with this from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King to just remind us that what affects one directly affects all of us indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality. And I just love this quote because it just reminds us that we are so connected in many ways, good and bad. And so it's important that we remember that. And specifically, families are connected to their children, good and bad. And until we recognize that and fully embrace it for all that it is, then we would truly not deliver on what we know is important when we talk about young children, when we talk about the early years. And so we have to really understand that families have a direct relationship, create systems, create opportunities for children to thrive, and that our job as the early care and education community is to help support that. I want to just kind of but I want us to kind of have some key points. So as I kind of talk today, I want to give some key points. So in case you have to go eat lunch, check on the kids, because my kids are here somewhere. They're always around, my 3 and 6 year old. But I wanted you to at least leave with some key points. First is that science is pretty clear that families matter for children's development and learning. That's pretty much standard. The kids stay with families for the most part. And we also have to recognize that many families are dealing with intergenerational and current systemic racism and inequities. Um, and especially when we think about the history of early kin education. And so it's really important that authentic partnership with families should really be viewed from a social economic justice strategy and not just from child development strategy. We have to really think about what is it that we can do to support families, not just to be the best parents, because parents know what they're doing. Is that, do I have the capacity, the capability, the resources, the support, the system to help me do what I can do the best way that I can do it? And so partnering with families is one of the strategies to ensure children are healthy and are thriving. And that's something important, that families in themselves cannot do it alone, especially if they're within a community and also a country. And so I'm going to leave you with the 4 E's, which is the importance of exploring, having high expectations, educating families, and then also really equipping families. And that's really foundational for family engagement and support. So before I kind of get into the whole family and what does that mean for family engagements, I kind of want to sort of remind us that family engagement support should really be bi-directional. Usually we think of family engagement as, what am I giving? What am I doing for? And really, family engagement should be about building really authentic, real relationship with families. The same way we want teachers and educators to build relationship with children, it has to be built on authenticness. And it needs to be about supporting families' well-being, and also developing strong relationships between parents and children, and really continue to support that ongoing learning and development for parents, for children, but also for educators and systems. Oftentimes we think about family engagement as really, how do we help educate families, give them stuff, all these sort of, in many ways, pejorative ways of family engagement. But really, we have to also begin to think about, what are we gaining from engaging with and supporting families? We're gaining a lot of things. I think when we begin to think about the bidirectionality of family engagement and support, then I think we can really harness its role as an economic and racial justice sort of strategy. So we know from both literature and extant data about the value of family engagement. So I'll talk about sort of 2 of the seminal studies that really help to provide the rigorous evidence about early kin education. So obviously I'm part of HighScope, and HighScope from the para-preschool studies, one of those studies that have been used to continue to promulgate the importance of early kin education and the importance of investing in it, not just for today, but for tomorrow and our future. And so with the HighScope para-preschool study, you know, it showed the importance of early intervention. But what is often not discussed is actually what really happened, right? So when you talk to some of the teachers, like Miss Evelyn, she talks about what they actually did, right? Which is never usually in most of the literature, about how they really connected with, worked with, supported. There's a lot of family and school connections and partnerships that really happen. Remember, we're talking about in the 60s, where there's a lot of racial strife, right? And so to think about an educator is sort of this sort of abstract being is not real, but they were really part of the community, right? The teachers knew what was happening in the community. They engaged with families, right? And that was part of the job, is that family engagement and educating is a social political act, right? As Gloria Lansing-Billin talks about. So we have to see family engagement as a social political sort of action that requires us to be supporting families, but within a context of what's happening today, what's happened in the past, and what is our role to help support them thriving and being successful parents and family members. Similarly, we also have the Carolina Abecedarian study. There's a lot that's not talked about. What do they do with families, right? To what extent was it an important part of the literature that never makes it into the literature, right? We think about, oh, you had teachers that were educated, you had the active learning, you had curriculum, intentionality, but we never talk about, so where were the families? Do they just let you take their kids for 10 to 12 hours and say, okay, bring them back when they're 6? So again, we have to think about, what is the role of families and why are they not making it fully into all the literature, particularly when we talk about some of these seminal studies. But obviously we know with Head Start, that is part of this 2-gen model that has been in existence And we have to continue to push on how is Head Start really thinking about family engagement, not just from how are you supporting and engaging your child, but as an advocacy, how are we supporting families to advocate for systems, education systems, early child systems to work for them as well as their children, right? So this is part of where we have to begin to interrogate what we think we know, and to really push on what is it that we're doing with families as opposed to what are we doing to families, right? Especially when we're talking about families who are in poverty, families of color, we tend to always talk about it from what are we doing for? We never actually talk about what do they do for us, right? These programs of families, particularly Black families, helped to create what we are all here part of. Without them being quote unquote tested on, I would not be here. And most of us, if any of us, would not be here without that. So that is part where I think about family engagement from a much more social justice and economic justice and even racial justice end of things. Hold on, I went too fast. Okay. So even contemporary literature now, so the National Academy of Science, a nonpartisan group, that does a lot of consensus report about what do we know about something. So they did a report in 2016 that really pointed out that parenting matters. And that was the title of this publication that I was fortunate to be part of. And it really showed the critical importance of supporting families to ensure children are healthy and thriving and also excellent. And the one thing that probably still boils me a little is that a lot of the National Academies report that focus on children birth to age 8, they reference financing, they reference the workforce, they reference many things, but they actually really reference the parenting piece. And I think it is time that no matter what else is produced, what else is done, that we begin to centralize families on so many levels, that we begin to understand that families are the crux of everything that we do in early care education. And I'll say, obviously, and COVID-19 has reminded us of the importance of centralizing families in so many levels. And so what did the Parenting Matters actually tell us, right? It told us that for parents to do their best, they have to have some knowledge of child development and levels of evidence-based parenting. And many families actually do know that, right? They do know, we know that what their child needs, right? But we also found out that attitudes about parenting roles in raising children matters, and the attitudes about whether it's breastfeeding, whether they're supposed to be an active partner in education, that some of those attitudes, which a lot of times are based on history, but also systems that never thought of them as valuable. So again, parents may have attitudes about early care education or schooling in general, but that is not because of they just came out of thin air. It's because of systems that told them, you are not valuable, your thoughts are not valuable, and we do not value you. We just need your children to keep our programs running, right? So again, we have to think about what are the messages that we send, either directly or indirectly, about parents and family engagement. But what we found is that the things that really matter universally, now I want to make sure I point out with the Parenting Matters report that we really focus on the universal pieces, but we know there's some things that are much more localized, like racial socialization. And we can talk about that as well later on if people are interested. But we do know the things that really matter. And these are things that we as the early care education system, from researchers to practitioners to policymakers, et cetera, community members, these are things that matter. We know that now, right? That contingent responses matters, right? That's serve and return. Your child says, hey, mommy, I look at the garbage can. What do I say in response to that? Oh, that's great. Can you tell me about this garbage can? Showing warmth and sensitivity, of course, right? Routines and reduce household chaos. In COVID-19, my household is a bit of a chaos. And they have no normal routines, but how do we create that, right? Shared book reading, talking to children. We know in many cultures that book reading may not be the norm, but oral storytelling are such a critical part of both attachment, but also how you transform and transfer information and knowledge about your culture, about your identity, about your traditions. And we also know that practice that promote children's health and safety, from prenatal to breastfeeding, vaccination, all that matters. And of course, use of appropriate discipline. And these are just universal things that we know matters for children's development and excellence. And so the question is how we decide to engage with and connect families to this information is really, really important. And so the research also doesn't tell us a lot of things, doesn't tell us everything, right? It wasn't able to tell us how do we create interventions for parents with children with special needs, right? Whether it's developmental disabilities or parents who themselves suffer mental illness or other substance abuse. There's no interventions really that really talks about how do we fully engage fathers. Those are now emergent in many ways. So we can say there's a lot more emergent than there was before this publication was created. And then how do different cultures show warmth and engagement, right? That's not just Eurocentric. And I would say, obviously, in this time, we haven't fully understood or we know how do we help parents and families who are dealing with racism and all the the sequential things that come from a racist society and a racist system, right? So we know we are trying to help families deal with poverty, but racism is a different category than poverty. So how do we begin to think about interventions systematically, but also interpersonal, to help parents and families deal with the impact and the effects of racism? So this sort of brings me clearly to the conversation of COVID, as I sort of alluded to earlier. So to me, COVID-19 in many ways is almost like could be a reset for early care education on so many levels. But as it concerns how we engage with and support families, this is probably the place where we can really begin to do a reset. COVID-19 has basically shown us that parents are central, right? Like there's no childcare program, no Head Start program. If you were locked down, you didn't get children. The children remained with the families, right? The families had to translate and transfer anything you want to share. If you sent work packets home, somebody had to do it at the house, right? Whether it's a parent, a pseudo parent, a relative, a cousin, a sibling, somebody had to translate and transfer that information that you wanted shared. So COVID-19 has been a good reminder, and there's been works obviously being done by various researchers and entities about what is the impact. And from some of the research that we're seeing come out, and so for 7% of all caregivers reported being concerned that they won't be able to return to work. And that means that the childcare community is probably going to start thinking through how do we continue to support children through families. And then 67% of caregivers said that they expect only themselves or their spouse to provide care. So this means that basically we have to center a lot of what we do within early care education into the household, the community, and families. And part of what the Rapid EC research basically recommended, right, policy-wise, is that we have to focus on meeting the needs of parents and other caregivers to really support the needs of children. And so to me, COVID is an opportunity for us to truly, really rethink what are we doing in terms of engaging with, supporting with, and centralizing parents and families as part of the early childhood system and programming. And with COVID-19, it sort of reminds us about parents and their role in children's lives, but it also reminds us about the disproportionate burden of illness and death and other inequities among racial and ethnic minority groups. So for example, we've heard and we've seen the racial disparities as it concerns COVID-19. This is one example of people hospitalized. So we see that, white people make up 59% of the population, but 45% of people who are hospitalized, so less than their population. Whereas Black people make up 18%, but then 33% of those hospitalized. And then Latinx, 14%, but 8%. And so you can see the vast disproportionality, particularly with Black families, around population and hospitalization. We've also seen that in terms of the death rates, both for Black and Latino families. So what does this mean for us? It means that a lot of our children and families are living in really harsh environments. Their work environments are clearly toxic in that they have to be essential, which means they have to go to work regardless of whether there's PPEs or any other safeguards. There's a lot of underlying health conditions, whether it's heart disease, diabetes, et cetera. Again, this is not because of just individual decision making. This is systemic. And also they have to also deal with racism and economic injustices. So again, why do we see these disparities? Because of the system that has been created from 400 years ago till today. And all of these living conditions, work circumstances, underlying health conditions, they literally impact families. And so we have to begin to be part of the solution and not part of a system that continues to perpetuate inequities in many ways, even though we sort of keep thinking that we're doing the best for our children and for our families. I think my voice is coming back, so thank you for your patience. And so part of early care education, the whole rationale has been that children come in the early years, they get ready for school, then they graduate school, then they make all this money, and then everything is perfect. That's not what's happening, right? We know from data that we have a lot of number of children who are part of the intergenerational poverty, where their families were poor, their grandparents were poor, and this we have seen cycle through particularly Black people, and then now with Latino people and even indigenous populations. And so this number about the child poverty is where you see literally that, you know, Black people and people from indigenous populations are likely to be poor compared to other groups, Latinos included. And so that means that poverty is a problem that we should be thinking through from a family engagement lens. Yes, reach to your child. Yes, engage with your child's school. However, if you're not helping families through strategies that really create assets, create wealth, ensure that they're not going to be victimized by another pandemic, then what is it that we're doing, right? And that is the question of what is the goal of early care education and family engagement centralized to that. What is the goal if we're not trying to eradicate poverty, eradicate racism, and ensure that children themselves are thriving and families are thriving, right? Because if families don't thrive, it's challenging for a child to thrive since families come within a part of that system. And so while we think about poverty, I want us to really think about the issue of wealth, right? So we know the median net worth of white families is almost $140,000. And remember, wealth is after you account for all the debt. And that's more than Black families, about 12, and it's actually going lower. It's probably like more like 10 now. And then it's actually been much lower compared to Hispanic. So white families have a lot more wealth and assets compared to Black people and Latino people. And what does that mean? That means that if something like the pandemic hits, you have an asset you can call upon. You don't have to deal with being an essential workforce. If you have medical bills, you can cover. If you have to go to school, you can cover. You have all these assets. So for families who are worried about housing insecurity, food insecurity, you know, we now know data from New York has shown us that families with infants and toddlers are rationing out food, right? Imagine during the time when brain is developing and you need as much nutritious food. So the fact that you have to ration food is something that we should all be truly concerned about. And that's because we have created a level of wealth that doesn't exist. We have a lot of people of color who do not have, they may have some income, but they do not have wealth that they can call upon. Especially during this global pandemic and other kind of pandemic that we've had, like the recession from 2006 and 2008. So, and I'll pass this one because it pretty much is the same thing, that many Black people, Latino people, indigenous people are likely to live in poverty. And I want to make sure that we also know that white poverty looks very different than people of color poverty. And that's because of the wealth and asset issue, and also being a white person in America, right? There's a privilege to being white, and there's a disadvantage to being of color. So we have to think about, even though there may be a sense of this poor people, and that's very true, they actually function differently. And again, we could talk about what does that mean for parenting and family engagement. Control the slides here. So I can't stress it enough, right? The family engagement, and that's the way I see it, can be a tool for racial, social, and economic justice. And while we want to definitely attend to families being engaged with their child, having strong relationships with their child, which I completely agree matters, we have to sort of take it front and center and say, this has to be a strategy that helps to free families from the burden of being poor. As somebody who grew up poor, you know, I don't want to, I mean, nobody says, oh yeah, I want to be poor and I want to be poor for the rest of my life. That is not a choice that's often made, and kids and families want to be in. So what is our role to help bring families out of the shadows of poverty in many ways, because that's not where you want to be, but family engagement could be the driver to do that. So how do we support families to address racial, social, and economic justice? So let's stay for the ride. So let's hope, you know, my voice stays, and I don't lose it, which means I've been talking too much. So here's the 4 E's. I kind of put it in this 4 E buckets. And this is based on my research, others' research, and just my reading of the literature as well. So this brings in even my work with Head Start, Educate, like a lot of this comes from my lived experience and what I've read, and a lot of the work that's been done by many, many, many people and families themselves. And so it's called the 4 E's, which is really culture responsive, anti-bias framework around family engagement. And so really it's around how do we support families with an economic, racial, and social justice lens. And that's through expectations, exploration, education, and empowerment. And I'll explain shortly what do they all mean and how they could be supportive for you and your work. So the first is really about this idea of exploring the funds of knowledge of families. And I think a lot of us have probably heard that term, funds of knowledge, but that means that we have to actually see families as valuable and then when I mean families, maybe I should be very specific. A lot of times we're talking about actually families who are living in low wealth circumstances, and particularly families of color and even linguistically minoritized families, right? So a lot of families who fall into that bracket oftentimes are not viewed as important and valuable to the system or program. And so the idea of exploring who they are is something that's critically important. Like, what are your experiences? Like, we never, I mean, not say never, because I know some of us do it, is that we really ask families, what is it that you're experiencing? Right? When my child's school, you know, asked me, oh, Iheoma, what would you like to know? I was like, I would like for you to ask me, what am I experiencing right now? What is it that I'm feeling right now? Right? Like, I mean, you know, like being able to just ask families, what is it that you are experiencing? How can I be a resource to you? How can you know, what is it about your family that we should know about? What is it about your children that we should know about? Like being able to explore families, and I don't mean exploit, right? Big difference between exploit and explore. But how to explore and understand what families are, right? Your poverty doesn't define you. Your race doesn't define you, even though you know, this country may define you based on your race. But is that there's so much richness in families, and to be able to understand that will be really critically important, right? And that includes the fears that family have, the history that they have, right? I have family with African roots. That is very different than some families who may have a different kind of, you know, route to America. And that gives you a sense of who they are, their assets, their privilege or disadvantage, whatever it may be. But that is one of the critical pieces to being an asset and a value to families, is by really knowing who they are, know who you think they are just because they're in your program. Okay. So this also means that we have to begin to say, how do our policies and programs either perpetuate inequities or privilege, right? Do we only privilege certain people, right? Because we find you valuable, right? Whose voices are not heard and whose voices are not being sought, right? Is it the family that's like, oh, they're never here? Well, why they're not there? Is it because they're working 3 jobs? Like my mom worked 3 jobs and had 7 kids, right? What is it that they think and believe, and how do we get that information? So we have to push ourselves to do more than the basis of, I think I know you based on the assessment form or the input form. I need to know who you are as a family and begin to see the richness and the value that you are. The second part is about expectations. And so expectations is one of the most predictive things for children's achievement and children's outcomes is expectations. So we must have high expectations of families and their ability to be the best, right? Like that is so important. And that means that we have to have expectations, not how white could you be or how rich you could be, but to have the expectation that you are the best, you will give the best, right? Especially if the circumstances have been set up for you, right? So some families were not set up to be successful. For example, Black families in particular were not set up. If anything, they were actually, systems were created to dismantle a Black family, right? Whether it's through enslavement, whether it's through Jim Crow, whether it's through incarceration. So Black families in particular were set up to not be successful. That is systematic, and we know that from the data, and we know that. So what is it that we do to ensure that we hold high expectations, but also create the environment for families to live up to the expectations? Like, I don't want your pity, but I do want your help. And that's a big distinction. And so are there obstacles that we're creating for families to not meet the expectations that we have and they have for themselves, right? And so this is part of how do we interrogate our programs, our services, but also the systems that they're part of that literally ensures that the self-fulfilling prophecy of, oh, they're not engaged, oh, they don't care, is set up, and that you will always get that information. But when you look at it from a more systematic lens, you understand, yes, she or he has to work 4 jobs. Yes, he was killed because he was just, I don't know, riding, the bus, right? Like there's certain things that are set up that will create this self-fulfilling prophecy, but it's not because the family did not want to be engaged, did not want to be part of their children's learning and development. So we have to begin to really query every piece of what we think we know about a family and begin to ask directly, who are you? What are you? What can I do to support you? But also query the system and say, what is it that you're doing to not support all families to quote unquote reach the American dream? The third one is about education. And I don't mean education in sort of the formalized sense, right? Because, the data does suggest that even for people of color, when you get your education, it does not confer the same value, just FYI. But we should all encourage education. But when I say education, I really mean it's by educating families about systems and opportunities. We can guarantee, and we know this from all policies created, they were not created for poor people, and definitely not for people of color, and definitely not for Black people. If anything, they were created, as I said earlier, to disenfranchise and disadvantage, whether good intentions or not. They're pretty much created with that lens in mind. And so we have to begin to educate families about systems and opportunities. And that means we have to begin to create networks. We have to begin to empower, to create these conditions that can help support families, right? So who's part of their network, or who's not part of their network? Sorry, my thing there. What are the rules that may exist about accessing resources and supports that families don't know, right? And this is not about it's not about basically force feeding information to families or saying, I'm going to take you to the social service office. It's about informing families about, here's what the system of the U.S. looks like, right? Here are the privileges being given to people. And here are the opportunities that I can help create. Here are the networks, the social capital I can help transfer back to you. And that is our job, is how do we not only educate families about the child development piece, but how do we educate families about how do they attain assets and wealth? That to me is that if you're not doing if you're not helping families to get assets and wealth, I will question your purpose. And I hate to be very blunt and kind of militant about it, but I think we have to begin to say, what is our value to families if we're not trying to create their freedom to be the best that they can be for their child? And so that means that we have to elevate families' knowledge about policies, about systems, because we know that systems are the largest barriers. Policies are created to either help you or hurt you. And in many cases, it's systematically done to, unfortunately, hurt a subgroup of people. And then the last of the E's is empowerment. And I've kind of stopped using this word because it does have this, most of us are on a journey. And so, we're like, that's not really what I meant, right? Once you become even much more mired in that science, is that I don't know if empowerment is a word I want to use. And I may encourage all of us to maybe really think about the word empowerment, right? Because what it basically suggests is that you have no power, which is true technically in many people, in Black people and people of color places, that you have no power literally because the system wasn't created for or by you. And so we're giving it back to you. But what I probably really mean is that we have to equip families to navigate and also challenge the system. And so we have to help families to create sort of anti-racist and anti-bias systems that truly provide equitable opportunities. Right before I think I joined the call with Ingrid, I was reading this New York Times piece by Nicole Hannah-Jones. And so if you have not read it, I encourage every one of you to, as you're on your Google right now, the New York Times piece, and I can put the link in the chat box whenever I get a second. But it's one of those pieces that really speaks to how do we actually equip families, right, to really be the best of the best for their children. And for families of color and Black families in particular, it's going to take a while because of the way the system was built. So as much as we want to sort of pound them with read to your child, respond to your child, they could do all of that. But until the system itself changes, we're a long way from that real freedom and that long way of equitable opportunities. And so I think for those who are in early care education, it's important that we understand that we can only do the part that we play in, but we have to understand the forces that makes our job harder. And so if you're doing family engagement as your true profession, if your job is to really support families in order to support children, then we have to begin to really be much more mindful about how the system makes it particularly difficult for families to do the best they can. And for certain groups of families, it's even harder because of the way the system was set up. So I think part of equipping families is to equip them with the knowledge about how the system truly works and where there are opportunities for them to find some level of freedom and some level of opportunity to meet the needs of their child and their community. And so the question that I have for everybody who's on the call is, how do we create anti-racist and anti-bias systems that truly provide a fair and just systems? And it just can't be just Black or brown people. It has to involve literally the coalition of multiracial folks that we see during the protests. We, as the early care education system, we have to create our own protests through the way that we work and the way we function. Are we equipping families through a Eurocentric middle class, cisgender lens, right? Or are we saying, families, who are you and how do we help to support you to navigate the system that is probably going to take a while? It's probably going, I don't know if it's going to change. I'm hopeful, but I'm also a pragmatist. I'm a reality kind of person. I believe in what I see, not what I hear. And whose humanity is being empowered to continue to have privilege versus those who are not. So this is where, to me, the empowerment is kind of the word we use with families, but I think what we have to do is begin to equip families to fight for what is deservedly theirs, but may need to ensure that we are providing them with the information, that we're exploring who they are, that we're educating them in many, many ways, educating them, right? We're not just educating their children, that we have to be part of the fabric that educates families, but not just educate them, but support them and create the environment for them to do and be their best. And so what are some things that, how do we kind of get to sort of this 4 EPs? Sorry, I think my things went up. I would say, that we have to view families as equal partners, right? In many ways, we should actually say, family, what do you think, right? It should be equal, because I'm not going to give control of my children to you, right? Again, because I have privilege, I can decide that. But we have to, I think for us, we have to begin to not sort of say, we know best. We have to really equally partner with families in the most authentic way. We have to sort of step back, like COVID-19 is allowing us to step back and begin to ask families, how are you doing, Ms. Smith? How are you doing, Mr. Thompson? How what can we do to help support you and support your child? Right now, we have to tailor interventions to meet the specific needs of families and not what we think they need, right? And you can only do that if you understand who and what families are and what they're doing. And we have to sort of integrate services and collaboration to really support families, right? Because some families, there's multiple needs, right? They may need childcare, they may need some health services, some mental health services. But to ask me to go to 5 different places when I have to go to work, and now with COVID-19, I need to avoid people, how do I get that done, right? And we have to create opportunities of, and I call it the village, right? I come from the African diaspora, I was, and even here in where I live, there's villages. I have villages of peers who help support me mentally, who help engage me, who help lift me up. And we need that for our families. We need to create those peers and those networks to really, 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 really help connect families together. Because the power of togetherness and community is really what makes people thrive. This ideal of individualization is really faulty, right? There's nobody in America who made it by themselves. And so this idea of we support meritocracy or individualism is literally not true. There's nobody who has wealth who did not get it from either slavery or enslavement, who did not get it from social benefits. That's humanly not even possible. So we have to create opportunities for parents to really be connected to each other and to others as well, because that community is what drives and thrives, is through that level of communalism. And that's really very globally centered. That's how most countries function. And we have to address trauma. And most of us think about trauma as sort of the abuse. We think about sort of incarceration, maybe. We think about poverty, if people put it in there. But what we haven't talked about is the trauma of racism, right? The trauma of microaggressions, the trauma of micro insults, the trauma of micro invalidation. When somebody literally has not asked you, how do you feel? being sort of a Black father? How does it feel to know every day when you walk out your house that you may be killed or arrested? How do you feel that when you wake up that you're just happy to be alive and that your kids are happy to be alive? Who lives in that sort of who lives that life where their soul and their humanity is always questioned, right? We don't talk about that when we talk about trauma. We talk about trauma that seems to be like, oh, we're all just, all feel trauma. Our trauma of racism is so deeply embedded in the system that it's so invisible you don't see it, but we don't talk and ask about that. So these are things that we can begin to do. Is we have to heal on one hand, at the same time we have to continue to move forward, and that is going to be the hardest part. Is how do we do both? We have to make programs culturally relevant, right? We can't just make programs universally. We could try. We have tried, and the data says that we have not gone that far, right? We have made some great strides, some great improvements in early care education, right? But we have so much ways to go, especially if we continue to create programs that pretty much are quote unquote colorblind. And to me, that is the problem, that we have used this color blindness to not even address the fact that racism exists, right? We have to watch a man get killed for us to acknowledge that racism is completely part of our culture, is completely embedded. And so how do you begin to create programs that address issues of historical trauma, contemporary trauma, but racism and white privilege? How do we do that in a way that's culturally relevant, that gives humanity back to people who have not had it? And then what does that mean for involving fathers, engaging fathers, particularly Black fathers who are there, want to be there, but often are made invisible or ignored or devalued? So to me, the reaching these 4 E's will require us to kind of take a step back and to be part of what's happening today. And so parent engagement, family engagement has to really take sort of this attention to how do we do family engagement in a way that is both focused on racial justice, on economic justice and social justice. We can't just do it because we want kids to read. Kids will learn to read, but would they also have freedom as they're reading? That is always a question. Will you have freedom? And so how do you go about creating, this sort of anti-racist, anti-bias family systems and strategies? We have to not privilege whiteness, right? We have to say, hey, family is a dynamic system, right? Like what I am today with my 3 and 6 year old is probably going to be different when I turn 50 and they're like what is it, not 10 because I'm too young for that, no, but when they're like teenagers, right? Like it's going to be different. It's a dynamic sort of thing. And so we have to be part of that development, but we also have to recognize that families create a culture that works for them, that helps them thrive, that helps them live, that helps them be happy and joyful. And so we have to honor and respect that. So early care education has to be part of both honoring families, but also helping them be better, right? That is the job, is to be better than what we wanted people to be better than where they were. And that to me is the value of family engagement. We have to think about respect. We have to think about empowerment. We have to think about honoring, challenging them. Like I love it when other parents challenge me to think and do better, right? Like it's not a horrible thing when you tell a family, you need to do X, Y, Z. Yes, tell me that, but tell me why. Tell me how it gets to my freedom. Tell me how it benefits my children, my community. That is the power of what family engagement could be, is to really be the truth sayer of family and family engagement. I think family engagement, has not gotten the full attention it needs in early care education. If anything, I love teachers. My mom was a teacher, and I'm gonna say that ahead, but it has sort of been put as a second-class citizen, right? For those who do family engagement, who talk about family engagements, anything has been put in the second-class citizen. And I think that hopefully will change. And I hope that most of us who are on this call will continue to push on that. If we want anything to do with the achievement gap, or as Gloria Lansdale will call it, the education debt, we have to start centrally with families. And so it means that we have to change literally a lot of what we're doing now. We have to literally center research, practice, policy on what makes families thrive, period. What makes them essential. If your policy and programming does not make them essential, then you are literally doing the wrong thing. That is my challenge to us, is to centralize families in all pieces of what we do. When we do that, I think we'll see the outcome that we want. So ensuring racial, social, and economic justice will lead to child well-being and learning, because this is only possible through families. If I'm not well, my children will likely not be well. If my husband's not well, my children will likely not be well. So this is where we're centralizing it ensures that family will be well and will also be excellent. And we can't wait till kids turn 3. We have to start literally before people are parents, right? Because when you're a parent, everything goes awry, right? I'm a developmental psychologist. I knew about parenting, but not parenting my son Aries or my daughter Alani. I didn't get the book. I didn't get the book. They are who they are, and I have to kind of go with them, and hopefully me and my husband are doing the right stuff. Right? You're like, oh, I hope I got this right, right? So we have to remember that family and parenting in many ways is sort of this, I hate to say it, test drive. You got to figure out what works. And knowing the circumstances and the context we live in would drive some of our actions and our activities. And so we have to think about, where does early kid education situate when families are trying to figure things out, deal with society, et cetera, et cetera. And so to me, authentic family engagement is only effective through a just society. So if our society is not being just, then family engagement cannot be the best it can be. So part of our job is to make sure that the environment that families are living and thriving in is the best it can be and the most just that it can be. And so I'll just end here to remind us that it really, 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 really takes a village, right? Me as a parent who I think I'm pretty good as a parent, I think. And I have a 2-parent household, I still think, and I know that we need to have a village, right? And so we know that our children need a village, and parents themselves need a village to also be the best parent. And so we have to honor that, right? We have to honor that families are a system, and that part of our job is to create the village that helps inoculate them, that helps to support them, and that helps them to thrive, right? And that is part of what we have to do, is remember that we are a village for a lot of our families in many ways, and we cannot ignore that. I have I was going to play this video from Ken Hardy, but so when you get the slide, I'll say go ahead and play it, but I'm going to just play like a minute of it because I do want to get the questions, but I do want to play a minute of it just because in the time that we're in, and me as a Black, person who studies family engagement and works in family engagement, I think it's important for all of us to hear this because it matters. So I'll just play a couple minutes and then I'll stop there for questions. And hope you can hear it. Oh, I don't think so.
Yeah, Iheoma, I think when it crashed earlier, when the slideshow crashed, then the buttons didn't get pushed again.
Well, so. That's okay. I'll just say what this Ken Hardy was talking about, the untold story of Black America, is really the cusp of the 4 E's, in that for Black families and some other indigenous families, we don't know the true story of who they are. We write about them, we study them, but we really don't know who they are. And so it was a call, and I saw it as a call to action, and I hope it is for you all when you see it, that really is about, there's a lot of untold stories of Black Americans and Black families, and that we have to begin to help narrate that. And we can't narrate that without ever exploring who they are, without asking them who they are, not who we think they are or who we think they should be. And so as we work with our families, as we support, engage our families, that part of the job is not to create a single story about who they are, but it is to make sure that we help them be their best selves in whatever capacity that it is, and that we can't tell their story for them if we don't know who they are and have never asked them who they are. So hopefully you'll get the slide, and you can actually just Google Ken Hardy and this exact title and you'll get him, but it's a 5-minute YouTube, and I hope that it calls to you, whether you're helping and working with Black families, or whether you're working with Latino, Indigenous families, or white families, that we have to begin to really explore who families are, but also explore our role in ensuring their freedom and their asset development. So with that, I am done talking. I think I have a lot of my voice, well, some of it, like 80%. I want to just say thank you all so much for just being here with me. Sorry for some of the technology difficulties, and of course me losing my voice halfway in, but I hope that it was meaningful to you, and I hope it's meaningful to your work.
Thank you, Iheoma, and we have about 10 minutes, so I hope you can do a few questions. We've had a lot of activity in the chat room and the Q&A. I've been trying to keep up with it, but
I can't see them. I know, I feel bad.
So first of all, I want to say to everyone, thank you for coming today. And I'll just remind, there's been a lot of questions about getting the recording and getting a certificate of attendance. So everyone who attended will get an email tomorrow in about 24 hours with your certificate. And this recording will live in the NAEYC, the NAEYC Virtual Institute Library as part of the Virtual Institute. It'll live there till July 17th, and then we will take it and move it to our HighScope website. So you'll have plenty of time to rewatch it and find the information that you want. So with that, I will move along to the questions. The first question that we received early on in the session was from Sarah Rose, and she asks about outreach to the families. How much outreach is too much? If you have a parent that is not engaging or responding, and you know that they are okay, that they're not sick, is a weekly check-in a good base to start at? We know parents are overburdened, and we don't want to stress them out even more.
That's a really great question, Sarah. Thank you for your question. I feel like it's hard to kind of say, do you check in every time? But this is where, when you have a relationship with families, you kind of know, right? You kind of figure out what is it, how much was the frequency. I would say when next time you reach out to the family, it's to ask them how, in what capacity, frequency should I check in on you? Is it okay if I just even send you a text to just say, hey, how are you? And feel free to respond or not. I know the idea that families are burdened. Trust me, I know the feeling. I have, I work full-time, if not more than full-time, and I have 2 young kids. I'm only burdened if there's a sense of you don't understand me. I'm only burdened if it feels like you don't understand my lived experience. I'm only burdened if it feels like you don't care. You just want something from me, right? If you want to sort of check up a box and say you worked, right? But so, the idea that families are burdened, they've been burdened for a long time. If you're living in poverty, you have been burdened. But that doesn't mean that you don't want to talk to people, that you don't want to experience joy and talk with other adults. So I say, in the end of it, don't view yourself as a burden if you are truly authentically committed to that family's freedom, that family's wealth and asset development, and just being of service to them. And I think with that, the idea of burden is less so, right? If you see yourself as, in many ways, people have been using the word ally, but if you see yourself as a support system to the family, it's not a burden. So you call them every day, even checking on them every other day is not a burden, because they understand that you see them, you hear them, and they're visible. And that to me is it's hard to say how frequent, but I think if you have a relationship, you will know, and you can ask, and sometimes just asking will tell you the answer. They will tell you, don't call me Miss Smith. Don't tell me Miss Angela, I don't need you right now. I'm busy or I'm working, right? They'll tell you. Just have to ask.
We have another question from, and this is probably still related, but Ann Blackstock Bernstein. Many ECE teachers are already overworked and underpaid, so I hope that the burden of responsibility for improving family engagement will fall on programs and systems, not on individual teachers. But if that fails, as we often see policymakers fail to act, what can teachers do to support and engage families beyond learning about anti-racism and economic justice and sharing resources with families? Do you have specific tips that wouldn't place too much burden on teachers' time? That was a long question. Did you?
No. Thank you, Ingrid. I understood the question. And so this is where I think, and that's why a lot of times I call out the early child systems and programs, because in many ways, a lot of our early child educators are the families I speak of, right? You live and breathe as the families live and breathe, right? We know from our data that over a third of early kid education providers are also in the same social service system. So to feel like they're sort of immune or inoculated from the families is, I don't think of it that way. So I agree that I think a lot of this cannot situate solely within educators. Obviously, and I would say similarly, it can't situate only within the family engagement specialists for the programs that happen to have those. This is a system issue. But I do think what teachers can do is similar to, do some reach out, right? Like really understand, do some reach out to your specific families, to share information, maybe even creating a peer network. Sometimes it's not that they need you per se, teacher, but it's that you create the infrastructure and the environment, whether it's, text messaging environment, or whether it's a Zoom circle that they could all come to, at a given time. You make the space and they will come to it. So things that are low ask could be just creating the environments, right? Connecting parents together who may have similar age kids who are in the same community, right? So there's a lot of little things you can do to just help families without you having to do it because you yourself are also burned in. And I would say, because you're an educator, you have information that some families may not have. So if there is information that you're able to share with families, then I say do that as your due diligence. If there are ways you can push your programs, your systems, what early childhood is part of a large active coordination. You're part of NAYC. You can say, hey, NAYC, I would like to do X, Y, and Z. So we can actually use our voices to create the environment to support families. It doesn't have to always be this direct, I got to go to families. It could really be, let's use our position as educators, our privilege as educators to do that.
Here's a question. We probably have time for at least one more. Here's one from Vonda Clemens. How can we, and teachers, supervisors, and administrators, reach out to the children and their families when we don't live in the community in which they live?
Well, nobody can. Even if you live in the same community, you're really kidding. So this is and we know that obviously we can say we know there's mobility. I mean, and we know families are just. I mean, I know I don't get back to my text for like 24 hours because I've been so swamped with text or work, etc. And so even if you don't live in the community, you are part of their community, right? So community doesn't have to necessarily be where you live, especially now when most people couldn't even go out. Your community, you can reach out through many mechanisms. So it could be just sharing information about, here's information happening in your community, or just reaching out. I think it's similar to this earlier question. I think at the end of it, the idea of sort of localization, it's kind of been blown up, right? The idea that we all have to function in this virtual world, and we probably will have to continue that in many ways, right? I think we're gonna have to figure out, how do we connect with children? How do we support children and their families when we have to social distance, when we have to wear masks? If that's even an option, for some parents won't even allow their children back into anybody's program, especially if they have family members with underlying health conditions, right? So in the end of it, I think that the idea of community is still alive and well, which means your local community. But I think we have to see ourselves as part of the village that families call on. And so to me, it's really about creating that village and seeing ourselves as part of the elders, as part of the networks, as part of the family members. I think and this is where, if we weren't doing that, this may be an opportunity to begin to do that. And, technology gives us that opportunity. Smartphones gives us that opportunity. Social media, right? So if you follow some of your families, you may see what's on their mind, right? And that could help you, that could alert you to, I need to be more engaged with the family in this way. So I think we have to, there's more tools out there than we know. And we have to begin to really use those tools and not be afraid of what we may learn about our family, right? We may learn how active they are. We may learn of so much assets and the brilliance that they are and the happiness that they exude, but we've never asked them or seen them in that same light because we saw them as a client.
Okay, well, I think that about wraps it up because we only have like 1 minute left. So I want to thank everyone for coming today and really appreciate your participation and such a great conversation. And I loved watching I was watching both screens, the Q&A and the chat, and going back and forth. So it was really nice to see all the feedback. Once again, I'll remind you that you'll get an email in 24 hours with your certificate. You'll find the recording we're going to send this recording over to our colleagues at the NAEYC, and they'll post it in the virtual library. So you'll just have to watch for it there where all the other recorded sessions are. So thanks again for attending today. Thank you, Iheoma, for sharing all your wisdom with us, and we'll see everybody next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Be
Bye-bye.
well, everybody. Bye-bye.